Not long ago, I made a video about the 2020 rendition of Battletoads, a game I really loved despite heavy backlash. I had a lot of praise for the game and the risks it took while remaining faithful overall to the spirit of the IP's roots. But people are naturally opposed to change, which explains a lot of the umbrage I take with the 2021 reboot of Nickelodeon's Rugrats. If you added together the hours I spent watching any given cartoon when I was a little kid, Rugrats was definitely up there with SpongeBob and Pokemon in my consideration. Though that's probably thanks more so to the sheer volume at which Nick leaned on the show to fill out their schedule. It's not a show I necessarily hold near and dear enough to devote a whole video to in most situations, but it's one I'm familiar and reverent of, enough so that the reboot incensed me to talk about it. This is normally where I chat your ear off about my disdain for how many reboots lately are shoved down our throats as consumers, but I'm sure you've heard that enough, and I don't see what tired punchline I could make about Girl Meets World and Powerpuff and Fuller House and Riverdale, Turner and Hooch and Lost in Space, He-Man and New Saved by the Bell, Doogie Howser and iCarly, She-Ra, Animaniacs, Rydell High and Muppet Baby, Spyro, Sir Daniel and Crash, Frasier, Shafted, Lion King, Voltron, Sabrina and Gremlins, Toxic Avenger, Shaman King, Mighty Duck, Shrek, and Monsters, Inc. As far as that parade of reboots goes, Rugrats didn't seem like it'd be anyone's favorite or the big public enemy at first, anyway. It seemed to just resemble the original, simply inflated into 3D, but as more details became apparent, it was clear that Rugrats 2021 was going to be its own beast, as despite the many choices clearly made to look familiar, the show was riddled with changes. Some may argue were pretty arbitrary. I always try my best to argue in good faith, and my kindest bottom line to discuss Rugrats is that it's frankly confused in a way I think a lot of reboots end up being, with the best of intentions just really misplaced. In the interest of that good faith, allow me to start with what I can praise about the show unabashedly. One thing that the reboot keeps intact really well is the imagination of the old show. I was nervous that a reboot with a modern child audience in mind would do away with the framing that made the original Rugrats so memorable. The art and direction of Rugrats did an exceptionally good job putting you in the shoes of an infant, with fisheye points of view and perspectives that made the world feel huge. This in turn lent itself to a surrealist tone Rugrats took really frequently, as a baby trying to wrap his head around something new and frightening to their fresh mind was often scary, and took shape of these creepily crafted dreams and hallucinations. I'd say the reboot does a really good job emulating this element of the show. I really thought that the nightmare sequences would be toned down, if not outright removed, or deemed too scary for today's youth, but just as I was by the giant baby from Angelica's Bad Dream back in the day, modern audiences will find plenty to be disturbed by in way of creation of the Rugrats' fragile psychologies. The show also has the original Rugrats style of satire down to a T, a lot of plot points feeling like they'd fit right into the old show, tackling trends and fads from a simple baby's point of view. One-off characters like Lady Declutter, a parody of Marie Kondo, and similar movements are cut right from the same cloth as Dr. Lipschitz, which is a hard tone to hit just right. The babies themselves feel right at home, too. Everyone's original voice actor returns without skipping a beat, sans the tragically departed Christine Cavanaugh, leaving Chucky to be voiced by Nancy Cartwright, who's frankly a seamless change. E.G. Daly still brings an infectious energy to Tommy, and Kath Soucie still really makes me laugh as both Phil and Lil. You may be wondering what on earth could be the problem if the babies are still intact, considering they are the babies, the Rugrats, right? Well, as I grow older, I recognize that an even bigger part of Rugrats' legacy was the sheer staying power of the adult cast. I think it's harder to recognize when you're a kid, but 50% of every classic Rugrats episode was tied to a wider conflict concerning the adults of the ensemble who grow more relatable with one's years, and revisiting old episodes in response to the reboot, I was wildly impressed by this facet of the old show. The adult stories were often surprisingly cynical, and the writing was astonishingly sharp.
We don't have a pony, Angelica.
Then how come you told Mommy Aunt Didi got saddled with a loser?
It's this aspect of the show that the reboot really reinvents, this version taking place on a sliding timeline and adjusting to take place in the modern day, making all of the parent characters millennials and retooling their archetypes down to their very fundamentals. You'd think this might actually be pretty intuitive, especially considering the most prominent adult character, Stu Pickles, was a dreamer and inventor struggling to fund ends meet with an unconventional lifestyle, but the reboot reboot does very little to touch on how relevant this stripe has become for the millennial generation. The only real modern slant added to Stu's character is a newfound fixation with video games. But this adds very little to the character. It certainly isn't reductive, but Stu was already a pretty rich personality with his career struggles, inventiveness, and contentious relationship with his brother, so it still reads as rather arbitrary considering all of those facets feel smoothed out in this reboot. Though, the adult character who experienced the most changes was far and away Grandpa Lou, a cantankerous war vet in the old show, being sculpted into a more mellow and lucid new age hippie type. While at the very least most changes of this show strike me as a result of a generational shift, Lou feels more like they just wanted to write an all-new character and assigned it to an old character's design. Lou could sometimes be intense, and maybe some felt he was too mean-spirited for a new audience, but I feel the joke of the character was that he was sometimes just as immature as the babies despite his age. This new approach to Lou meant a new voice as well, and I don't think the new choice of Michael McKean really hits the mark. Lou had two incredibly talented voice actors who have passed away, so he was never just going to sound the same, but all the cartoony fun of the character is just sapped out of this new incarnation.
What's wrong? I've been playing this chess game by mail for 15 months, and they went and destroyed it in 15 seconds! Oh.
Son, have you ever had an elephant sit on your back?
Once in a video game, why?
Now you're missing the point.
In fact, all the adults have new voices, and while Grandpa Lou went from the most over-the-top adult to the least, most of the other adults have grown more cartoonish through their new voices when it was their humanity in the old show that grounded Rugrats and made their B-plots so resonating. Chaz, Dee Dee, and the rest used to have these organic but still distinct voices that feel Flanderized up to 11 in the reboot. Best explanation may be a demonstration.
What's disco?
It's something that happened a long time ago, and it's never coming back, so don't you worry.
We're limiting Tommy's tablet time to educational content.
Thank you. Maybe we should keep this in a safe place for now.
Oh, my sad little man. It's that scary robot, isn't it? Well,
in addition to the character voices, the shift to CGI also hurts the art style, if you ask me. The old Rugrats was a bit grotesque, but I always thought this was to its advantage of seeing the show's scope being from the eyes of a baby. Have you ever seen a video of a baby seeing a dog for the first time and finding it hilarious? Because they've never seen such a thing, and there's a lot to wrap their head around. That's what I always saw in the Rugrats' kind of crude art style. Everyone's unflattering, exaggerated features, and weird lopsided heads. It feels downright alien, just as a baby would see the world. Look at Drew Pickles in particular, who immediately looks uptight and posturing, a ball of stress and self-satisfaction ready to pop, and how smoothed out he looks in the reboot CGI style, despite no real fundamental changes to his design. The switch to CGI meant doing away with the sketchy imperfections of the original show, and with that, a lot of its personality. It's this weird cocktail of alterations that have really left a bad taste in my mouth, and the adult cast of Rugrats was once arguably its most charming element. With that addressed, I feel it appropriate to discuss the aspect of representation and how this version of Rugrats handles it. My opinion on the matter should probably be taken with a grain of salt, considering my experience is largely that of the most represented demographics there are. With that in mind, I have praise for the intent of Rugrats 21's desire to be more diverse than its predecessor, but not necessarily for the execution of the matter. I think representation is a crucial thing to prioritize, and Rugrats certainly commits, but I think their choices are a bit misplaced, the most controversial change being the establishment that Betty DeVille in this new show is gay. This was organic enough a choice considering how queer-coded the character always was, to the point that to a modern audience especially, the fact that she ever had a husband probably stuck out a bit. I think this is an important thing for the show to address, but I don't think the show tackles the matter gracefully by erasing Howard DeVille from existence and pretending he never existed. I'm all for gay Betty, by all means, I just can't help but feel it would have been better to build on what we already had rather than wipe the slate clean. Even if Howard was never exactly a pivotal character in Rugrats, cultivating a dynamic like the DeVille family, only to flip the table on your audience, is a lot like dismantling a chess game your grandpa has been playing by mail, for 15 years over 15 seconds. If Rugrats 21 wanted to explore Betty's sexuality, I think it's a bit short-sighted to jump to the conclusion that Howard was the thing standing in the way of the writers. Rather than just awkwardly act like he was a collective fever dream, I could see a lot more worth in recontextualizing Betty and her relationship with Howard. Perhaps delving into her being a queer woman in a straight-passing relationship and how she feels that places her in the LGBT community. There's any number of routes you could take, and sure, maybe Rugrats isn't the place to unveil that Betty and Howard had something to the effect of a scandalous lavender marriage, but Rugrats has always respected its audience, exploring steep themes like separation, financial problems, and even death, as many stories focused on Chucky losing his mother to illness when he was too young to even really remember her. With all that in mind, I can't help but feel disappointed that new Rugrats took kind of an easy way out. The other relevant adjustment comes in the treatment of Susie Carmichael, a recurring character on the original show who's been adjusted into a full-time member of the main cast here. And again, on the surface, I really like this idea, but how this shift is handled begs even more questions. Susie in the original show was a girl Angelica's age, and as the oldest kid the babies knew, she was defined by her autonomy and how she'd use her maturity to advocate for the babies, and in a way I imagine many found quite empowering. Where an issue arises is the fact that when Susie is incorporated into the main cast, she's seemingly aged down to the baby's stature, or at least is written as less mature, meaning Tommy and friends lost the sort of mentor figure they had before, forcing the once driven and sisterly Susie into yet another character at Angelica's mercy, which I find to be kind of a letdown. In light of sympathy to the writers, it was probably hard to have a character as driven as Susie in the main cast, since her capacity to dispel Angelica would do the same to any conflict within an episode. But again, if representation is as important as postured, I can't help but feel there'd be a way to make this character work while keeping her personality recognizable. I like to have discussions like these in the best faith possible, and I really like to think that choices like these were made in response to the call to action to widen representation, especially in a show where a factor like this was as stingy as within the original Rugrats. The thing is, I'd perhaps be far less critical of these elements if the show weren't rather regressive in other ways, largely in that it seems to have a rather mean-spirited view of women. Charlotte Pickles could sometimes be self-absorbed or dismissive in the old show, but the new show's Charlotte is unrecognizable, constantly placed as a heel, taking antagonistic measures in a way she rarely was before. This kind of permeates into the Lady Declutter one-off character, which, while I praised for how organically it feels like Rugrats' style of satire, also characterizes a successful and revered woman as shallow, fraudulent, and materialistic, and I'm hard-pressed to imagine someone who felt Marie Kondo, of all people, needed to be taken down a peg. It seems any woman who hasn't committed herself to homely motherly duties is ripe for slander on part of the writing of the new Rugrats, which, whether read as a misread of long-standing characters or anything malicious, doesn't bode well. So, bearing in mind how many oddities in the new Rugrats seem to stem from wanting to completely do something new with many aspects of the show, I have to wonder why the premise didn't just turn into changing the babies we knew into millennial adults and having new Rugrats of their own. We already had Rugrats Shippuden, this would be a step beyond that, while remaining a return to form if Tommy, Chucky, and company grew up and had their own babies. The formula can stay the same, but the potential for new stories and subjects remains. I can't think of a more intuitive way to have one's cake and eat it too in this particular case. That's a chance to have more representation by retooling the main cast. You can have a main black character without completely reinventing a previous one, and maybe Lil grows up to be gay. The possibilities are endless without sacrificing the IP recognition that seems so important to Paramount. I think something to that effect would be much better than the excessive and meaningless changes in the Rugrats reboot, which are wrapped in an eerily familiar exoskeleton. I'm not an executive or anything, so I can't be positive this is the case, but it's my observation that because streaming is so startlingly becoming the new normal, everyone wants their own streaming service, which requires a lot more content than one might think. I imagine it's not cheap or easy to just pull new IP out of thin air, which is why the practical tactic is to look at which properties one has easy access to and exploit those, which is why Rugrats is premiering on Paramount Plus alongside 2 SpongeBob spin-offs and an iCarly reboot, and why we feel so absolutely flooded by reboots, revivals, and remakes that feel just as confused, if not more so, than Rugrats 2021. Many of these shows are all new crews wanting to make new art, but boxed into the confines of the copyrighted properties they have access to because the media landscape has never needed so much media. It's hard not to feel bummed out by this chaotic and overwhelming state of affairs, but hey, crying about it is for babies.